Hi everyone. So the goal of this video is to look at energy systems. So your learning target is to compare and contrast the three energy systems our muscles use. So first of all, let me just say this is one of my favorite topics because I love muscle. I studied muscle in graduate school, and this idea really captivated me when I was your age and in college because I was really interested in the human body and how it worked. So let's go over one thing that we talked about recently, which was myosin and how it is like this molecular motor in your muscles. And it's this motor that makes your muscles contract, which I think is so cool. I mean, you have millions of these little motors that make your muscles contract. So any little movement you do when you are playing a sport, when you are jumping, when you are lifting weights, whatever, is because of these little molecular motors. And we talked about the four major steps that myosin goes through, but one thing I want to just point out here is that this cycle, what we call the cross bridge cycle, every time you go around this cycle, and myosin goes around and around this cycle like hundreds of times, um, you know, when it's doing its job. I mean, literally dozens of times a second when it is moving at its fastest rate. It needs ATP every time it goes around that cycle. And when you think about how many myosin molecules are working at any given moment, you need tons and tons of ATP. And ATP that we've talked about before, it is an energy molecule. It is the energy like currency of your body. So we're going to talk about where that ATP comes from. And, muscle needs a lot of energy, so where does that energy come from? So when we talk about ATP, this is what the molecule looks like. So you have adenine and then a ribose sugar and then three phosphates. So it's adenine triphosphate. So that's what ATP stands for. And every time you break down an ATP into ADP and phosphate, you release some energy. So ATP can be broken down into ADP and phosphate. And when you do that, you release energy. And so our muscles are constantly breaking down ATP and turning it into ADP and phosphate, especially when they are working, like when you're doing some kind of exercise. All right, so this is a reaction that we are going to talk a lot about. And this idea of ATP being broken down is crucial for our muscles to work. So we have three energy systems. The first one is called creatine phosphate. The second one is called glycolysis, and the third one is aerobic respiration. And I'll say right now, some of the vocabulary in this lesson might be confusing. I might even make like a special should do lesson all about vocabulary. Um, but if you understand some of the vocabulary words, then you're in good shape. So I'll try to break down what they mean. But those are your three systems, and these are the three pictures of them right here. So we have um, creatine phosphate. You can see creatine phosphate shows up right here in the picture. We have glycolysis, which just comes from this idea of breaking down glucose. You might remember building a glucose molecule in the beginning of the year. I had you guys work with the models of carbon and oxygen, and I think I had you guys play around with those little molecular kits to kind of build a glucose molecule. It's a pretty crucial molecule because it leads to ATP. And then the third energy system is aerobic respiration, and that's what this one is down here. It's called aerobic. The word aerobic means that you need oxygen. So the first two energy systems don't require oxygen, but the third one does. So that word aerobic means that you're using oxygen. All right, so let's break down these three energy systems. All right, creatine phosphate. So it's this first picture here. One thing I want to mention right off the bat is you will see many different phrases for the same energy system. So don't be caught off guard by these words if you are using some other source and suddenly they start using the word like phosphagen. It's all the same system. All right, just different words. Phosphocreatine, ATP PCR, phosphagen system. It's all the same system. But basically, um, this your muscles have a bunch of creatine phosphate stored up, okay? And there might be some ADP in your muscles as well. So the general idea is when your muscles are at rest, you have a lot of creatine phosphate. When you start to use your muscles, whatever ATP you had in your muscles gets used pretty quickly. But you have creatine phosphate in your muscles as well. And when your muscles start to work, that creatine phosphate donates its phosphate to ADP. And so now ADP becomes ATP, right? It goes from a diphosphate, two phosphates, to a triphosphate, which has three phosphates. And that's where you get ATP. And now this energy is ready for muscle contraction. All right. I'm going to make a comparison later on, but one thing I'll point out right now is this process creates one ATP molecule for every creatine phosphate. All right, the next one is glycolysis. Again, a few also known as terms here. Glycolytic system, you can kind of see glycolytic, glycolysis, you can see the connection there. And then the other one is lactic acid system, which I really don't like the name of. And we can talk more about lactic acid. I will not get on my soapbox right now, but yeah, let's avoid that for now. I'll talk more about that in class if you want to. But basically, we have sugar, the sugar that we eat, that's like the glucose that we eat. We eat sugar, and that sugar is usually just like glucose. That glucose can be in our blood, it could be in our muscles, but basically that glucose can be broken down into two molecules of pyruvate, which is our really small molecules. And then from that, we also get two ATP molecules. All right, so there's a series of chemical reactions that happen here to go from glucose to pyruvate. But the important idea is that we get two ATPs for every glucose molecule that we break down. All right, and then finally, aerobic respiration. A few also known as phrases. You might see oxidative system, or you might see oxidative phosphorylation. Some pretty big words, I know, but let's just try to break down what's happening here. So we have a few things that can be used in this energy system. We can use the glucose, we can use pyruvic acid, we can use fatty acids. So in other words, like the sugar that we eat and the fat that we eat can be broken down in our cells and be used to create ATP. And then that ATP can be used for many different processes in our cells, but one of the main ones when it comes to muscle is myosin making our muscles contract. All right, so we can eat all these different things. They get broken down and to make ATP. So there's many different chemical reactions that are going on here. Two important ideas I want to point out. One is that this is happening inside the mitochondria. So if you remember from biology class, or if you've ever heard the phrase, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, which is a phrase I don't know, science people hear a lot. But it's because this is where we make tons and tons of ATP. So when we say it's the powerhouse, it's because it's making a lot of energy. And the other thing I want to point out that's really important is that this process uses oxygen. Like I said before, the other two processes do not use oxygen, but this one needs oxygen to work. All right. And this process is very efficient. It can make up to 36 ATPs. So there's tons of ATP over here for every one glucose molecule. All right, so a quick chart to make a comparison. You have each pathway, and I show you here how many ATPs you get per molecule. So for every creatine phosphate, you get one ATP. For every glucose in glycolysis, you get two ATPs. And for every glucose or fatty acid or whatever, you get 36 ATPs. So this one is the most efficient. Duration. So if you're exercising, creatine phosphate only lasts for like 5 to 15 seconds. Glycolysis is good for anything that where you're exercising from like 60 to 90 seconds. And then aerobic respiration, that's the pathway that you would use if you were exercising for a long time. Here I just show you like the byproducts of each pathway. This one is the simplest one, carbon dioxide and water. And so when we are doing aerobic respiration, our body makes carbon dioxide, and that's what we breathe out. We breathe out carbon dioxide as part of this process. So the carbon dioxide that we breathe out every time we take a breath, it's because we are making carbon dioxide in aerobic respiration. And then finally, one thing I said last slide, where does this stuff happen? Well, these two happen in the cell cytoplasm, just like anywhere in the cell. But this one happens in the mitochondria in the cell. All right, so it has a special location inside the cell. All right, and then last thing I'll point out is like just a comparison between these in terms of like how long do they last? And again, this is kind of what I said on the last slide, but this is a good graph to kind of show it, where the phosphagen system or the creatine phosphate system really peaks out at the first few seconds of exercise. So when we look at the percent of total energy, um, in the first few seconds, almost all of your energy is coming from the phosphocreatine system. And then after that, it drops off quickly. It just runs out of phosphocreatine. And from there, you start relying more on glycolysis. All right. And then over time, that kind of drops off. And after about 60 to 90 seconds, your oxidative system is where you get most of your energy. And that's true for 2 minutes on, right? That's going to be the predominant energy system that you use for any exercise that lasts longer than 2 minutes. And then this next chart has a lot of information, but I think it's kind of cool, especially if you're into sports and athletics and you want to know which energy system your sport uses the most. So this is a little bit overwhelming, but there's a lot here. So pick a sport, any sport, and you can see which energy system does that athlete use the most. So let's take basketball. If you're a basketball player, your body uses mostly the ATP PC system or the phosphocreatine system. You also use you also use glycolysis and you use the aerobic system, but most of your movements, your quick movements, your sprinting on the court, your jumps, whatever, you're going to be using this energy system. Um, let's see, football, right? That's an explosive sport. Each play lasts 5 to 10 seconds, and that's exactly how long this energy system lasts. So it kind of makes sense that this is the energy system that football players would use. Let me find one that's like completely opposite. I don't know. Let's see. What about swimming? Okay, swimming a 1500-meter swim. That's mostly aerobic. And that's because this swim takes many, many minutes. So this energy system, or sorry, the aerobic energy system is predominant because it takes more than 2 minutes to perform this activity. So which system is predominant really comes down to like how long are you doing the activity and what kind of activity are you doing? If you're doing an activity that requires like a lot of explosive movement, or if it's an activity that is very short in duration, then you're going to be using mostly like ATP PC systems, or like the phosphocreatine system. If you're doing something that requires a lot of oxygen, or it's something that takes a long time, or maybe it's something where you kind of have to like pace yourself, that's mostly like aerobic energy systems. All right. So that's a lot of information, but like I said, I think it's very cool and I can talk about it for days. If you have any questions, please ask in class. I know some of you are athletes. I know some of you are interested in athletics. So I hope you guys have questions. And I'll stop here.